Reproductive technologies are very, very new, relatively speaking, in the course of humanity. You have Louise, the test tube baby, right? The first test tube baby was born in Britain in 1978, first in vitro fertilized child. So that begins the point at which these technologies start. And just like all of medicine, as we become more familiar with these certain aspects and as there's money to be made, I think those two pieces are necessary. The first is that we have to become more knowledgeable. But part of what pushes our knowledge is the fact that there's a profit out there. There's a lot of people who can't get pregnant who want to be pregnant. There's a lot of people who can't get pregnant who want to be pregnant, and they are willing to pay for it. Given those two factors, the reproductive technology area of medicine has exploded and given us quite a few different kinds of technologies that we can do. Now, when we talk about reproductive technologies, like I said, there's a wide swath and there's a wide moral understanding of each of those. They don't all necessarily fit nicely into one bucket. So the first one would be, say, fertility medications. Okay? Maybe, for example, a woman who doesn't ovulate very consistently might take fertility drugs to cause ovulation. That's one type of technology. I see this not necessarily outside of the realm of any other kind of medicine, where if you don't produce insulin very well, you can take some insulin, right, externally, in order to help your body maintain itself in that kind of a system. So, for example, fertility medications, to some degree, are not necessarily morally ambiguous. I think they're pretty straightforward. The problem becomes, if you take fertility medication, you have to be monitored closely because you may ovulate a lot. And if you ovulate a lot and you're trying to get pregnant, then we're looking at twins. If you see triplets, not fraternal triplets out there, chances are, not always, but for the most part, chances are they were on some kind of a fertility medication, because triplets are very, very rare. To ovulate 3 ova in a single month, at the same time, that's probably somebody taking drugs who has had difficulty being pregnant. So there's some risks in that, but otherwise, medications can be useful in those kinds of things. The second piece is intrauterine insemination. This may be used for those where the husband has either a low sperm count or low mobility, things like that. They're also, so they'll take the sperm, and instead of having it delivered naturally, they'll actually bring it all the way into the uterus, or possibly into the fallopian tube. They'll inject it directly in order to get the best possible result, right? You get the most concentrated amount into the right area at the right time. And so that's possible. Also, any person that's using a sperm donation center, where they are, maybe a single woman is trying to conceive, and she, or a lesbian couple or things like that, you have those issues there as well. So that has certain questions based on the scenario in which you're talking. Again, with a married couple, I don't see a problem with that. It's just putting the right pieces in the right place and removing some barriers. With a single woman, you start to say, well, gee, don't kids deserve their father too? And what they've found, it's very, very interesting. Now that we've gotten at least 20, 30 years behind us in this, they're finding that children born from donor sperm act much like children who are adopted, in that they want to find out who their biological parents actually are. And they go on quests to they want to know who they are. What do they look like? One guy, and there are ways that they can find this out. There are, the organizations usually keep records for medical purposes in case something is drastically wrong, or it's a genetic defect or something like that shows up in your 30s and they need to find out. So depending on the organization that you're using, the bank that you're using, they'll keep records. They all definitely, a lot of them keep records because people go designer shopping, I want a guy who's 6'1" or above, and he's blonde-haired and blue-eyed and scores 1,400 on his IQ and all that stuff. Now, today, I mean, you laugh, but designer babies are in. This is what people do. And today, all they can do really right now is increase the odds by using the gamete from a donor who has those characteristics. It doesn't guarantee anything. Nobody's going into the lab and splicing together a DNA molecule that guarantees that you can use this. They are, however, sometimes they'll use IUI if you have, say, 3 girls and you want a boy. And what they'll do is they'll separate the male and the female sperm prior to insemination and only inject now the male sperm to almost guarantee that you'll have a male child. Again, this costs money, so you're going to have to really want it, but people are willing to pay given that. So that's intrauterine insemination. There can be some complications with that. In vitro fertilization, this is the one that's in vitro, from the Latin in the glass, in the vial. Okay, this is where we take usually the woman is given a significant amount of fertility drugs in order to ovulate, right? So she ovulates 5, 10, 15 eggs. It depends on how the woman responds. And they collect those, and they put them in a dish, and they take the man's sperm, and they fertilize the eggs in the dish. So it's outside the body, it's in the dish, in vitro. And then from that, they will reinsert the fertilized egg into the woman and allow that to run its course in bed and go on. Gamete intrauterine transfer is another where they will take the egg, they'll take the sperm, but they won't mix them in the dish. They'll actually put them in the intrafallopian tubes and allow them to fertilize. And then, of course, you have surrogacy, where you bring in a third party in order to carry the child or something to that effect. So those are the kind of broad views of what happens, or types of assisted reproductive technologies. And they all have different levels of moral compunction. And again, the reason why I bring this up is because the situations change based on the actors in the situation itself. Our technology has run headlong in front of our ethics on these. And there are a lot of cases that are showing up, just like with any law, with any ideology, there are a lot of cases showing up that nobody ever thought about. And it's becoming a difficult. So the first problem that we want to look at, especially with some of the medical drugs and IVF, is over-fertilization before implantation. You've got a bunch of eggs. Okay, now remember, IVF is expensive, $10,000 to $20,000 per attempt. It requires at least 2 medical procedures for the woman. One, first of all, she has to be examined by the doctor. She's been given hormone-inducing pills in order to have her ovulate multiple eggs. And those have to be harvested, and that happens surgically in some way, shape, or form. So that's one procedure. And then, once those eggs are harvested, then they have to be fertilized and they have to be reinserted, reimplanted. That's at least a second procedure. So there's a lot of technology and a lot of downtime, and especially the surgical part of grabbing the eggs. It's a difficult thing. So what is the easier way to do it? You give her a lot of drugs, you harvest a lot of eggs, and now you don't have to go back in if the first time we try to get you pregnant doesn't work, right? That's what you do. It's much simpler. She doesn't have to go through a third surgery or a fourth or things like that. Okay, so you have all of these eggs. What do you do with them? Now, you can freeze the eggs. You don't have to use them right away. However, freezing eggs has limited success. Eggs tend to not last very well. Sperm, on the other hand, you can freeze it for a long time. That's why sperm banks are so plentiful, because it doesn't seem to bother them so much. But the eggs, you don't have a very good success rate. So if you freeze a bunch of the ova, you run the risk of trying a second or a third time with damaged ova. which won't produce a baby because they're damaged by the freezing process. So what most fertility specialists do is they take all of the eggs and they fertilize all of them. So now you have 5, 6, 7, 8 eggs that are all fertilized. Now they're not going to put 8, they're not going to do an Octomom thing. Matter of fact, the doctor who did Octomom was censured. And Octomom did have IVF, so it wasn't that, I would have assumed that maybe she took a bunch of fertilized, bunch of medication, ovulated too much, and then that was why she got 8 children. No, she had 8 eggs implanted in her. And the doctor was censured for that. He shouldn't have even done that. That's way too dangerous, okay? It's just insane. But what doctors will do is they will take the eggs, they'll implant some, and they'll freeze the rest. Now remember, even in natural occurring pregnancies, 40 to 50% of fertilized eggs spontaneously abort themselves. So it's not like this, not like every fertilized egg always ends up in a child. It's not that high a success rate. A lot do, but a lot don't. And because of that, we see 40 to 50% attrition of IVF embryos as well, just in the fertilization process. Doesn't matter, they're not going to make it. Okay? So what the doctor is doing is, it's a lot of money. He's hedging his bets. He will fertilize them all. He'll take 5 or 4 maybe, and he'll put the rest in a freezer. Because once the egg is fertilized, it can be stored in cryogenic storage. Boom. Right? Freeze them there. So that's what we have, multiple IVF embryos. Now you've got an issue. Okay? Now you've got an issue. Because when you have these eggs, you have 2 other choices that you have to deal with. One is, how many do you implant at a time? How many? Because, usually, sometimes you see 3 or 4 implanted at a time, with the doctor saying probably half of those won't take, or maybe 3 of them won't take, or maybe all 4 of them won't take, and then we'll go back to the freezer and try again. But what if they all do take? So your first question, and again, good people who are Christians who want to have children approach IVF and they haven't thought about the question of how many do we do this with and how often do we try? That's the first question. The second question is, what do you do with the human beings that you've created? What happens to those other ones? Now, let me I said implantation of multiple IVF embryos. And then the last thing is, if, say, the doctor implants 3 or 4, okay, how many of you have ever known anybody who's had quads? Hardly. You have? That's impressive. When were they born? In other words, were they premature when they were born? They didn't go 36 weeks. They're in college now. So do you know how much they weighed or anything like that? Yeah, usually they're 2 to 3 months premature with 4. There's just not enough room. I mean, let's face it, and the mother only has so many resources upon which she can give to her children, and the body tends to protect itself, so they will start birth early and things like that. So because of this, and because of the dangers to the child, what a lot of fertility guys will do is they will ask for what they euphemistically call a selective reduction. Oh, you're pregnant with 4 children. We're going to take a look, and we will remove 2. So basically, you'll have abortions. You'll remove 2 of the babies or 3 of the babies in order, if you only want 1, we'll take 3. And so, again, we have good people who want to get pregnant, and then they look around and they go, oh my gosh, we have 4 children. And the doctor says, if you keep all 4, you probably will lose all 4. They'll probably spontaneously abort themselves by month 5, and none of them will survive. So which ones do you want? But who put the babies in that situation to begin with? It was the doctor who chose to implant 4 embryos, right? Okay, so one of the questions that people need to ask when they start looking at these things is, first of all, what happens to the humans in the dish? Okay, you've got 8 embryos, 10 embryos, whatever it is, that are fertilized. They have a new genetic structure. We already agreed in the abortion section that these are people. These are human beings. Maybe at the very earliest stages of development, they are human beings. And you have 8 of them. You say implant 2 because I don't want to do the selective reduction thing. Okay. Are you willing to carry twins? Yes, I'm willing to carry. If you're willing to carry twins, we'll implant 2. And it's going to cost you more money. Realize if we fail that we have to go back and do it again and go back and do it again. You may only get 1, you may get 2, we don't know. But what happens to the others? What do you do with them? And most people haven't talked through this. They haven't thought about what happens to all of the extra embryos. That is the mother and father's, that is the child of their product of their conception. What do we do with them? Do we leave? And usually, there's three ways that they approach it. You can either A, leave them in cold storage for a while, right? Just leave them there. Well, the problem with that is that costs money every month. The cryogenic lab charges you for storing your embryos, and you got to pay for that. How many years are you willing to pay for that? What if you have the twins and you say, that's enough, I can't handle it anymore? Now what do you do with them? That's the first thing. And how many children are you willing to risk when you have this? Maybe you've started late. A lot of in vitro and things like that are women who are in either perimenopause or menopausal because they wanted to get their careers going first. It was interesting, there was in the New York subway system, in the New York medical system, there was a reproductive center where women would come in and they'd, 30 to 35, and they'd want to start having children, maybe 36, 37, that kind of thing. And the doctors would come in and say, man, do you understand that 55 is a very normal age to begin to enter into menopause when you cease being fertile? And that a lot of millions and millions of women are menopausal at 55, which means that they start perimenopause about 45. Okay. She goes, but you also have to realize that 45 is also a fairly consistent age to be menopausal, which means that you enter into perimenopause maybe at 35. After 35 years old, a woman's chance of spontaneous abortion, miscarriage, or birth defects goes up exponentially from 35 on up. Anything after 35 is considered by definition a high-risk pregnancy. We have been told that, you live your life, you get your career going, and later on when you can afford it, you'll have children. And these women were all walking in and they're saying, how come nobody told me that my time was up before I even got the chance to start? So this reproduction center would actually put ads in the New York subway trying to get this message across, and I think some women's groups made them take it down and that kind of thing. But this is, again, this is the brave new world in which we live. And when you start doing this at 45, are you willing to go through IVF a second time because you have frozen embryos? So, if I'm a Christian, I'm going to work with my doctor and I'm going to make sure, now if you're a Christian, this isn't necessarily always wrong. But if you're going to do IVF, you have to be very, very restrictive and hold some pretty hard parameters. Only fertilize the number of eggs you're going to implant. Or if you plan on being pregnant more than once, and you better really think about that because that child is there whether you change your mind or not. The best argument, I would say, only fertilize the number of eggs that you're going to implant and only implant those number of eggs of the children that you're willing to carry. That makes sense because what do you do with the extra embryos? Now there is, and what costs are you willing to bear? How long are you willing to keep it in cold storage, for example? Now, there is an organization. How many of you have heard of the Operation Snowflake? Okay, just a couple. Organization like this is nightlight.org. There are Christian organizations out there that allow you to adopt someone else's fertilized embryo. So if you're struggling with infertility and you want to have a child, there are Christian doctors who will help you by allowing you to adopt someone else's frozen embryo, put it into your uterus. You can have the full pregnancy. You can have the child. The only difference is it isn't your genetic makeup. It's the genetic makeup of the donor couple. But some Christians like this because it rescues these embryos who will basically not survive otherwise. Now, some people will, what happens is a lot of people will keep them in cold storage and for a while, and then it becomes, as life gets busier, less important, or they can't make a decision, or they really don't want children, they don't know what to do with the embryo, and they just simply stop paying the bill. And now it's the lab's decision. So you've offered your children off to a third party, whether they should dispose of them or keep them alive at their own cost. And that's a problem. You can see where that could be a problem. So stuff like this is an interesting alternative to, again, you're the birth mother. It'll be your child. And the odds of the biological parents trying to come and take such children away are far less than even regular adoptive approaches. Really, when you start talking about in vitro fertilization and what we should do, here's the question. How many people do you want to fit into a lifeboat? Should we allow more people into the lifeboat than is safe? Similarly, should we allow more fertilized eggs than we are willing to bear at any one point in time? That's the way to do it. So that I think that's an important analogy in order to start thinking about these things as you do it. And we don't talk about this stuff. Here's the thing. I hear a lot of Christians talking about IVF and the miracle of life and things like that. But nobody in the church, who's warning them about these? Because the doctors, a lot of times, they won't realize that you're going to have 8 frozen eggs. This is their standard operating procedure. This is what they do. And they'll say, well, we'll probably implant 4, but you'll probably lose 2, and so you'll have twins. And they don't talk about the other 8 in cold storage because that's just easier for them, And Christians don't know that these options are out there, that there's these issues, that there's these complications. How do we talk to the people? Why isn't the church doing more in order to inform these couples who are struggling with this, that these issues exist?